All right, let's just dive right into this explainer. Today, we're completely rethinking everything we know about existential risk, human history, and really the very architecture of human thought itself. Normally, when we talk about the future of humanity and the great filter, that hypothetical evolutionary barrier that kind of explains why the universe seems so awfully quiet, we tend to imagine these dramatic, fiery cataclysms. We picture giant asteroids, nuclear winter, or running out of resources. But the source material we're unpacking today actually suggests something far more subtle. And honestly, it's way more unsettling.
So what if the great filter isn't death? The crucial point here is that instead of civilizations destroying themselves with some massive dramatic explosion, they might actually just drift. They might get completely trapped inside the recursive informational systems they build. This framework we're looking at argues that the great filter isn't necessarily a single catastrophic event at all. Instead, it might be what's called a cognitive ecology. To put that simply, imagine an entire environment built literally out of our own ideas, algorithms, and data. Over time, a civilization's intelligence might scale vastly faster than its actual wisdom, and that leads to a state where it can no longer distinguish real physical reality from a highly persuasive self-generated simulation. Pretty wild, right?
Moving on to part one, physical versus symbolic reality. To understand exactly how a civilization gets trapped, we first really need to recognize these two profoundly different worlds we inhabit. Think about it. Historically, humanity battled the physical world, right? We had to cross treacherous rivers, grow food through brutal droughts, and survive vicious diseases. In physical reality, physics offers an immediate, totally unarguable correction. If you engineer a bridge poorly, well, it collapses. Reality steps in instantly to correct your error. There is literally no negotiating with gravity. But today, billions of us wake up not into forests or fields, but into a highly engineered informational ecology. We live in streams of symbols, synthetic images, and algorithmic predictions. And in this symbolic reality, ideas can reinforce themselves long before physical reality ever intervenes. Narratives actively recruit their own supporting evidence. And most dangerously, algorithms are designed to ruthlessly optimize for measurable engagement. They feed you exactly what keeps your eyes glued to the screen, with absolute zero regard for whether it's actually true. So we're shifting from adapting to the real world to adapting to our own distorted representations of the world.
All right, that brings us to section 2, the escalation of recursion. Let's see how this builds across history, because trust me, this isn't just some sudden modern glitch.
Looking back throughout history, each of these eras fundamentally reorganized our relationship with reality. They radically increased our capacity to modify the conditions under which future civilizations actually develop. Think about it. Agriculture reorganized land, making us settle down and build cities. Writing reorganized memory. It allowed the dead to literally speak their ideas to the living. Then the printing press reorganized knowledge. It didn't just mass-produce books. It completely rewired European thought and birthed the scientific revolution. Fast forward a bit, and digital networks reorganized communication, shrinking the whole globe into a tiny village. And today, artificial intelligence is reorganizing cognition itself. This right here is what we mean by recursion. We're no longer just manipulating physical matter. We are actively building systems that design human observers. The loop continuously tightens. Humans build systems, those systems shape our perception, and then our newly altered perception redesigns the systems all over again. Let's dive into section 3, the mechanics of thought. Now, before we can fully grasp the trap of this recursive loop we just talked about, we have to zoom way in to see how we actually process the world and generate thought in the first place. Okay, here's a truly fascinating insight. Cognition actually determines how reality is divided before it determines what reality actually means. Raw reality doesn't have neat boundaries. Think about a sprawling continuous forest. It doesn't just draw a harsh, magical line where it ends and a meadow begins. We do that. This cognitive act is called partitioning. Every category we invent, every language we speak, every distinct scientific discipline, they're all partitions. We continuously construct these boundaries just to make sense of a vastly complex, continuous universe. So thought doesn't begin with grand, sweeping ideas. It actually begins with the humble act of partitioning. And to manage this, healthy cognition requires a continuous, living rhythm. We engage with the world, immersing ourselves in symbolic life. Then we observe. We partition the world to introduce a bit of reflective distance. We deeply reflect on those boundaries, and finally, we return to engagement. If we just participate without partitioning, we get totally lost in unexamined engagement. Imagine mindlessly scrolling through a feed for hours on end, entirely absorbed but completely unthinking. But on the flip side,
If we only partition without ever participating, we become completely detached from reality, living purely in theory. True wisdom is found in oscillating continually between immersion in the world and maintaining a reflective distance from it. Which leads us to Section 4, the recursive trap. The real danger pops up when our civilization amplifies our ability to generate information without offering equally powerful mechanisms to correct our cognition. This brings us to a foundational distinction in this explainer. Intelligence is amplification. Fire amplifies our metabolism, science amplifies our explanation of nature, and AI radically amplifies our symbolic production. But wisdom is calibration. Calibration is the continuous, painstaking adjustment of our beliefs toward reality, despite all the noise, all the internal bias, and all those algorithms desperately trying to grab our attention. Think of it like steering a massive ship in a violent storm. Intelligence is the raw horsepower of the engine, but wisdom is the compass. A massive engine without a working compass just means you're going to crash into the rocks much, much faster. The recursive trap snaps shut when a civilization has massive intelligence but totally lacks wisdom. We can now generate information infinitely faster than our institutions can evaluate it, which means widespread delusion becomes incredibly easy to manufacture. Because of all this overwhelming noise, the limiting resource for our future is no longer information or computational power. We've got plenty of that. The number one bottleneck for civilization today is coherence. Now, coherence doesn't mean we all magically agree on everything or possess some perfect, unassailable certainty. Rather, coherence is our disciplined capacity to integrate new evidence and remain actively responsive to physical reality. When our shared symbolic systems optimize solely for engagement and outrage, our shared reality shatters. We rapidly lose global coherence while achieving local, highly isolated successes inside our own little echo chambers. And that, fundamentally, is how an advanced civilization quietly drifts straight into the Great Filter. All right, let's talk solutions. Section 5, the second-order solution. So how do we actually avoid drifting into the filter? Well, the source texts propose a philosophy, suggesting our only real way out is building an entirely new civilizational structure. See, we have spent all of human history as a first-order civilization. We use science and tools to study the natural world, constantly aiming to optimize production and survival. We built better plows, better medicines, better engines. But surviving our current recursive trap requires evolving into a second-order civilization. This means decisively turning our observation inward. Instead of just studying the outside world, we absolutely must study the actual processes through which we study the world. We have to start asking the tough questions. What institutional incentives distort our collective judgment? How does our technology alter our core observation? Instead of just optimizing for endless production, a second-order civilization optimizes for calibration, making sure that our thought processes remain deeply anchored to the truth rather than just raw efficiency. In the philosophy discussed in our sources, there's this really intriguing concept called Delta 88, and it represents this exact civilizational transition. You can almost think of it as the ultimate check engine light for human awareness. Now, it doesn't mean we suddenly reach perfect enlightenment or completely free ourselves from all bias, because, let's be real, no observer truly escapes influence. Instead, Delta 88 is that critical moment when awareness becomes capable of observing the very architectures that influence awareness itself. It's recursive self-recognition. It's this profound realization that recognizing our own cognitive traps isn't the endpoint of philosophy, but the absolute minimum baseline of civilizational responsibility. So, what does this actually look like in practice? Well, true calibration requires a massive structural shift across our core institutions. First off, education can't just teach raw facts anymore. It's got to teach epistemic literacy, literally giving students the tools to navigate wildly different scales of reality and misinformation. Science needs to heavily invest in the radical transparency of its own corrective mechanisms, openly showing us how it fixes its own mistakes. And when it comes to the press, media needs to finally stop treating human attention as just some lucrative commercial opportunity to be mined, and start treating it as a vital, highly fragile public infrastructure. On the tech side, AI development should be just as deeply concerned with cultivating reflective, critical users as it is with producing highly capable models. And above all, every single step of this requires extreme humility. We have to continuously improve how we correct ourselves as a species. This brings us to our final point, Section 6, the final recursion. We are standing at a historically unprecedented threshold right now. We're no longer just inventing tools. We're actively constructing the recursive environments that will dictate how the next generation perceives, reasons, and imagines. This quote perfectly encapsulates the stakes of everything we've explored in this explainer today. The future may ultimately depend less upon what civilization builds than upon the kinds of observers its creations cultivate. The civilizations that successfully endure the Great Filter aren't necessarily the most intelligent, fastest, or even the most technologically advanced. They're the ones that rigorously learn to remain truthful while becoming recursively powerful. So as you look at the algorithmic feeds, the synthetic media, and all those push notifications you woke up to today, I want you to ask yourself, is your symbolic environment actually cultivating your discernment and anchoring you to reality? Or is it just another filter, quietly blinding you to the world?